Welcome to LedgerNotes, the Cliff Notes of crypto conferences. I'm John O'Connell.
I'm Ari Aberman, and today we're going to be speaking about the Digital Asset Summit 2025 in New York City. This happened last week, so we went through the whole agenda of the different keynote speakers to bring you the insights of each of them. So we'll be covering as much as we can in the time we have, trying to give you a general overview and also the different takeaways of the session.
Let's start.
In day one, it kickstarted with Meltem Demirors, the founder of Crucible, that she gave a speech titled Believe in Something. There, she broke down a brutal stat. Without Bitcoin and ETH, the crypto space hasn't grown in market share or trading volume in the last 5 years. It seems like institutions are profiting from the infrastructure, but they're not participating in innovation. John, what do you think of this very big pain that we are feeling in the crypto bubble?
Yeah, it's a really interesting time to be in the space when you have data on chain that tells you everything that you want to know at a moment's notice. You have this incredibly engaging technology where we constantly are looking at charts, we're constantly looking at pricing data, we're constantly looking at speculation. But glaring statistics like there is no crypto adoption apart from ETH and apart from Bitcoin are alarming. Number one, I think that it also points to a battle of liquidity, a battle of minds in a much smaller market, a much smaller space. And it bifurcates Bitcoin into being its own thing as opposed to smart contract platforms like Ethereum and its perceived competitors, even though many of them are not really in competition with Ethereum today. So we're seeing constantly liquidity flow chain over chain. Doesn't really matter what layer the platform is. A layer one like Ethereum, a scaling platform for Ethereum in an L2, 3. Could be a layer zero or restaking platform. But any one of these layer platforms are essentially fighting for liquidity that every day is easier to transfer from one to the other. Um, but the amount of that liquidity is staying the same. The amount of use cases is staying static, and the adoption that we're seeing in the metric is incredibly alarming. And I think the other point that was made during that speech, which is important to highlight, and I'll pass it back to you because I'd love to get your thoughts on it, is that institutional finance is kind of just waiting it out and taking liquidity off the table from all of these chains, which is the primary reason why we're not seeing adoption outside of Bitcoin and ETH for these smart contract platforms. So I'll pass it back to you. What do you think?
It's funny that when I try to picture institution as a person, I believe like somebody reading the New York Times and like just a newspaper saying like, okay, crypto is money, so I'll just like put money in, take money out. But they don't see the technology and what it enables of everything that can be possible with the technology. So it's only revenue or it's only investment and that's part of the participation that institutions wants to do. It's like what we read like 5 to 8 years ago when there was nothing, just speculation. Seems like they're coming in their first year, in the first cycle, and saying like, oh, we can speculate, let's speculate. But they don't have no question about like, is this useful or not?
Waiting for use cases to take off, or do you think that they're just waiting it out and ciphering liquidity from crypto?
I think institutions are this corporate thought that they're not trying to find the new app, the new Uber to invest. They just want to put it in the forex exchange, in which currency it's gonna appreciate in the short term, and that's it.
Speculate, close liquidity, get out until it's a more probably adopted space. That's an interesting perspective.
On day one, David Mercer, CEO of LMAX, talked with Michael Ippolito from Blockworkls in a session called Headwinds to Tailwinds, the new era of institutional crypto. What was interesting there is like David was very optimistic on institutions joining in the next few years. They're preparing slowly. They're not coming in waves, he was saying. but it needs to happen two things. They talk about the convergence of institutions coming together, but one important thing that I believe is what he said, like what is missing is the credit layer. Institutions seems like be waiting to have credit to jump on board.
Yeah.
Have you seen this in John? Have you seen this in other places? Have you seen how institutions will react to credit?
Uh, Credit is instrumental in the traditional financial space, right? So obviously, there's credit scores in most countries. Those credit scores allow you to participate in the financial system, and in some ways, the self-custody space in crypto, it's trying to um, solve that problem where we have a permissionless architecture that anyone can sign into and participate with an internet connection. I think that that causes pause for institutional finance who can't figure out what the credit score is in a traditional way for a public address. Who owns that public address? I think that the AML KYC problem from a traditional finance perspective is well on its way to adoption and to being solved, not on a security standpoint of view, but on an adoption for satisfying regulations. I think we're very far away from thoughtful interaction when it comes to credit scores in the traditional space and how we might have a credit score system inside um, the DeFi space. But we can obviously lock and track value per chain, per asset inside of the blockchain platforms very easily. Um, and so you can verify that value. That's the preferred methodology of anybody that's on chain on some of these native platforms. But that value is not um, valued by institutional finance, by traditional finance, right? So what most people would say, hey, Bitcoin is the future. Most institutional, like Jamie Dimon, they'll call it a pet rock or a dead rock, and there's no value there, so there's nothing to do a credit score around or to collateralize as a loan. So I think until we can intelligently on-chain different pieces of information like digital ID, like a credit system or bringing a credit system behind a public address that you can then use in a more decentralized way, I think it's going to leave the traditional financial system in pause, personally.
Yeah, I agree. And until then, what institutions will slowly do, very little, step by step, will be to do their own classification of risk and do their own credit and getting it from somewhere in order to slowly step into the water and check how cold it is or not.
How do you think um, how do you think credit exists 3 to 4 years from now, Ari?
If we continue to in the path of DeFi loans that is happening, it's everything about collateral. This is a difficult word for a not a native English speaker. Collateralization. It's depending on how much you can collateralize, is how much credit you will get and how safe your project could be if the counterparty have your assets in one hand. This is what I've seen in the DeFi space. I can think like that could go the same way. I don't have the crystal ball, but until 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 the the institutions that give credit take more risk, it won't happen. I think this reminds me of of one of the dips of market cap this year. That's when in Japan, I think they put higher the interest on the loans, and everybody there's no more free money. We need to crunch everything together, and that made a huge wave in all the financial world, especially in crypto, giving a hard shock.
Yeah,
So I believe it will depend on them too to be able to assess the risk first to enable more credit for institutions.
yeah, better on-chain insights, which is talked about later on in the show.
Okay, on day one, Mark Thomas Arjun from Blockworks, a research analyst, interview Hadley Stern, the CCO of Marinade, on the State of the Union, Solana Validator Ecosystem Overview. And one of the things that they've been having conversation is like they're prioritizing stake transparency tools to track better data. What do you know about how validators or staking data works today, and why would they need to make it more transparent?
So this is a huge one, I think, because there hasn't been metadata that has been being passed in the background to the foreground of the blockchain for where those assets are actually being held and staked, who's custodying those assets, and what that interaction looks like. And in an unregulated environment, that's totally fine. When we move into higher and higher levels of regulation, as adoption hopefully continues to come, um, accountants, bookkeepers, financial professionals need to ask and be held accountable, help companies be held accountable for where that actual asset is and who's holding it. And I think that the level of metadata that Marinade is passing in these interactions is absolutely vital for the growth of the industry. They're leading the state of the art here when it comes to that, and it's going to streamline financial reporting in a major way. I think that in 3 to 5 years, it might even become not legal to not have that type of metadata with that transaction. I think overall, we were at a stalemate with regulation. We were at a stalemate at intelligence on a technological level, with some of the ways that the US government and Gary Gensler was trying to repurpose the securities law as it exists and apply it into these types of particular scenarios. And in some very bespoke interactions of a liquid staking interaction, there are no current uh, legal terms in order to classify that transaction. So I do think that it would be helpful to see some of these liquid staked tokens as a hybrid digital asset token and to start building regulation around it. It's something that I know multiple organizations are working on. And I think it will take years to really figure out with regulators how that will translate in accounting terms. But the number one thing that needs to happen is that metadata needs to be passed for who is custodying those assets. It absolutely has to happen. So, Ari, as it relates to Marinade and some of the staking and restaking, why is that important for an individual accountant or an end user to be staking or not staking on any given platform?
Well, as far as I understand, the tokens are different and it behaves different. So I think the accountant and the person who's trying to do the reporting needs to understand what type of asset lies below that. When they do the staking, they will put the money in the stake and it will go through a smart contract and they can like register that. But when it's liquid staking, what happens is like the the validator will give you back a token that has value and it has a different value from the one you put, and it will continue depending of which liquid staking token is, if it's yield bearing. So the price is going to go up as more money is put into the validator and more blocks are produced by that validator, or if they give you rewards as a yield outside of the token, so you receive two different tokens. That complicates a lot of work for the accountant, I believe. So it's very important for professionals to really go into each of the different protocols that the company is investing to know exactly how to record properly.
I completely agree. I think that some subledger platforms are going as far as to analyze the smart contracts for some of those interactions. But I think the accounting professionals, as they become more wise to um, that type of interaction between the actual assets themselves, will have questions of the subledger and how they're processing the automations for the contracts themselves and may disagree and want to do it a different way. So a lot of those automations are core to how you would be able to deal with the volume, but might not be the full solution that you can automate away, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, and don't get started with tax law on different tokens when they're wrapped and when they're not wrapped. If they're the same thing or not the same thing, it's another conversation.
Yes, absolutely. I would agree with that.
On day two of the Digital Asset Summit 2025 in New York, they talk a lot about data. They had a lot of insights on oracles, pricing infrastructure, policy, and the path to institutional trust. We had insights from the different speakers about oracles being the backbone of institutional on-chain finance, exchanges that don't agree on the same price and how that complicates the reporting. How crypto's bottleneck is not tech, but it's the regulatory environment that is slowing us down. Also, the settlement finality and ongoing reconciliation are the end game for crypto. We wanted to go through the session called Bringing the Whole World on Chain, that it was hosted by Adam Badrawi from Frameworks Venture and Sergey Nazarov, founder of Chainlink, and Stani Kulechov, also founder of Aave or Avora, as we know it now. There, Sergey Nazarov, he was talking about how data feeds are critical to scaling crypto and how oracles are not just price feeds that someone can choose, but they are the on-chain system that verify all the events, the contracts, and anchor the tokenized assets to the real world outcomes. So something that I wanted to ask you, John, is your comments on why oracles are important and why should they be, uh, why the selection of it shouldn't be taken lightly.
Yeah, an oracle in the crypto space is the backbone for, besides the infrastructure that it's actually running on in the blockchain, it's almost irrelevant if you can't price it, right? So they go hand in hand with each other. And um, Chainlink has always been a leader in the space for oracles, but there's many other oracle providers out there. I think one of the key challenges of pricing when it comes to oracles is the almost lack of OSS nature and how you're sourcing some of that information. So getting closer and closer to interoperability between oracles themselves, coming to streamlining some of the data for presenting the same pricing in the same second, millisecond, even across the global infrastructure is going to become incredibly important as we continue to push forward into um, uh, 2026, especially. Um, I'm seeing that there's a lot of adoption of real world assets and tokenization use cases. Maybe not the adoption of those use cases, but there's a lot of first tries in the industry right now. And uh, it is still yet to be determined how they're going to price those assets in a intelligent way and how that's going to interact with traditional finance. There's many different um, projects that are starting to um, produce fruit, I guess you could say, for what that interaction looks like. But there is no brand standard yet for those types of interactions. I think that Chainlink is a leader in the Oracle space for EVM networks, but there are also many other networks that also require Oracle pricing to interact with EVM networks. If you're on SLP in the Solana network, that's um, that's going to be incredibly important um, to sprint towards in the future, that interoperability between chains. I think one of the more fascinating use cases that will be coming is when you make a trade on Uniswap on Ethereum, for instance, but it's actually bridging and settling and pulling liquidity off of other chains because of that interoperability between oracles, which is a very future state today, but tomorrow will be very commonplace. What are your thoughts on that, Ari?
Well, my mind was while you were talking was drifting to to um, who says the oracles are right.
Yeah.
Like when a company has been using a different pricing from Oracle, and now the CFO is in front of an audit. So like, well, I use this Oracle. Like, who says this oracle is right? Auditors need to start paying more attention on the sources of these oracles. We have, for sure, as you said, Chainlink is one of the biggest of the EVM networks. But as more um, companies and institutions will start going into this different reporting of prices, is how can auditors be on top of oracles as well?
Yeah.
I think it's more a question than a thought.
Yeah. Getting pricing data in general, there's a couple leaders in the space outside of on-chain information, but the interactions on-chain are only priced through oracles. They're not priced through third parties. So there's an interesting interaction between exchange data that's being pumped in from the different exchanges and the pricing on those exchanges, which all vary, and the actual on-chain Oracle pricing. And in some cases, there's some overlap with Binance as a use case.
On day two of the Digital Asset Summit, Ben Forman, the founder of Parafy, also had a conversation with Dan Tapiero, CEO of 10T Holdings, on a session called The Mass Migration of Value on Chain. And among many things that they said, it's actually a very interesting session. Tapiero argued that traditional finance has two-day settlement model. That now, for people in the crypto space, it looks like a dinosaur. Like blockchain has instant finality, isn't that right? So how would that change what institutions usually take time for doing all their checks and companies use all the time for being safe on what they do when now blockchain is like
Yeah.
instant?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of really good, thought leadership in this space over the years for what it looks like when we have instant finality. I think that we've been promised an instant finality for a very long time. We have 10-minute block times with, Bitcoin. We have less than that with Ethereum, but still minutes. And then we have higher and higher throughput blockchains with Solana down to a second. And Sui being even faster than that. So I think that when we're looking at use cases, it depends on what we're talking about. If it's institutional finance, if it's payments, obviously in institutional finance, settlement is done through the SWIFT network, broadly speaking. And then if you're talking about payments, we're talking about the Visa network for settlement. Settlement in those networks, well, SWIFT is international payments, I should say, in institutional finance. Each country has their own different systems. In the United States, it's called the ACH network. There's also a FedNow that does instant settlement between banks, which is trying to be a competitor. A 2-day finality, it's instant finality between banks. So one of the conversations that you're having on a bank to bank in the US side of things is that FedNow will be that instant finality competitor to that experience. But when you switch over to retail, they may not actually experience that instant finality. I'm not trading or doing peer-to-peer settlements and payments through FedNow, and I probably won't be anytime soon. And I get that when I'm using a self-custody wallet and I'm operating on chain. So I think that um, that points more towards the payment use case. That looks a lot more like Visa, but it is a hybrid because if I needed to do a transaction with the Federal Reserve of a country as an individual, you can do those types of interactions on chain, whether you would want to or not, or whether it would be legal. That doesn't make any sense from the current perspective. Um, but that's a possibility that doesn't even exist in the traditional space, right? Um, some of the things that instant finality really messes up for in the traditional spaces, if there's a public address for a central bank inside the United States and it starts getting spammed instant finality with no type of settlement, NFTs, other types of tokens, meme tokens, spam tokens, because it's associated with that address, becomes incredibly difficult to actually source um, uh, and pay to a public address inside of some of these instant finality scenarios. So there is no concept of rejecting payments in the permissionless architecture of DeFi in most chains. And when we're talking about finality and use cases that come up between um, individual peer-to-peer transactions that would be competitive on the more consumer side of the space with Visa Network. we've only just begun to see what that looks like. If coffee shops start to settle instantaneously with microtransactions lower than what would be the equivalent of a dollar, maybe even less than 25 cents US in USDT and USDC on high throughput networks, um, you start to have GameFi completely revolutionized on app in-app games, in-app earns, in-app time spent, videos watched. And I think what you're going to see over time is the actual pay-to-play value escalate. The ads-based system in most countries where you watch an ad and you earn rewards that are in-app, that it's going to look more and more like actual cryptocurrency earned faster and faster as we're able to regulate and see that. So, um, as it relates to the traditional banking experience in most countries via a central bank, um, I think it is a wake up call to either adopt quickly a newer standard that would be able to settle quickly on the consumer side for payments or on the banking side between banks, because as this use case can starts to hit fintech in the traditional space, I think what we're going to see very quickly is these digital banks that don't have storefronts that have access to cryptocurrency and can spin up their own wallets become the new norm for banking both in the United States and also abroad in countries like Argentina.
That's very interesting. Here, completely, fintech has taken most of the people by surprise, and banks are just catching up for the last 4 years. John, I'm not gonna let ask me a question about it because I think we're over time. I just want to give a little bit overview of the day three of the Digital Asset Summit, and then we'll just close for today so we don't overwhelm the audience.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, what happened on day three on the Digital Asset Summit 2025 in New York? They talked more about the political part and the political side of this. But it did start with a very interesting analysis of a data analytics manager from Blockworks that said like blockchain revenue is a mirage without real user payments. Then we had the special broadcast of the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump. He made sure to address the public and talk about the importance of self-custody and mining, and really like shut off any doubt that people will have about CBDCs. I think distancing himself of the Eurozone. Then there was conversation about the crypto rails and how they can modernize global finance because crypto rails, as we talked before, they are interoperable, composable, and transparent. And the last key session that we found it very interesting is, of course, Michael Saylor, that after giving his always speech about Bitcoin being the one true apex asset, as he called it, he really talked about the treasury side of Bitcoin and how institutions and companies shouldn't take them as a short-term trade to recording the books, but treasury asset on equity to leverage the company value.
Huge speeches. That was the biggest day, in my opinion, as far as heavy hitters.
That's true. So thank you, John. I think it was a pilot the first time we're doing this conversation. I hope anybody who is still here hearing can give us some feedback on what they found interesting and what not, and we will be able to come back for the next event with even a better, more accurate insights for everyone.
Thank you so much. I appreciate being on the show.
Okay, see you next time.
Have a good one.